Today we are discussing brain waves, electroencephalograms, and sleep. All right, so an EEG is the common name for this. It's an electroencephalogram, also known as electroencephalography. And this particular measurement measures brain waves. It's a nice non-invasive way of gauging what's going on inside of the brain. You can put electrodes on the outside of your head and find out what kinds of brain activity you have going on without ever having to, open up the skull cap, for example. There's 4 different types of waves that are fairly recognizable from each other: alpha waves, beta waves, theta waves, and delta waves. And although there is some variability and some interesting aspects of what happens in here, generally speaking, the waves are defined by 2 different characteristics. Frequency, which is measured in waves per second, not by minute, but per second, waves per second, and this is also another way of saying hertz, and it's usually abbreviated Hz. And then the amplitude, which is the height of the waves. So these are 2 different characteristics that you'll see when we're looking at waves. And by the way, this will also pertain to sound waves down the line, frequency and amplitude. All right, so the first thing we're going to draw is alpha waves. Now, alpha waves, I think the characteristic you want to think about with alpha waves is that daydreaming would be a good example of when you would be experiencing alpha waves. Now, alpha waves are 8 to 13 hertz, which means they're 8 to 13 waves per second. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and draw a line and count out about 10 waves and draw another wave, another line. And this will be our delineation of 1 second. So we'll use this as a parameter to describe these are the number of hertz. So in this case, we have 8 to 13 hertz. So our number of hertz for this will be within that time frame. So on the x-axis, we have time in seconds. And let's go ahead and move on to our beta waves. Beta waves are our highest level of thinking. Whereas alpha waves tend to be synchronous and kind of all the same, beta waves are a little more exciting than that. This is when you have your highest level of cognition, when you are very alert and awake and really paying attention to something and focusing on it. This is 14 to 30 hertz, so 14 to 30 waves per second. So I made sure to get about 20 waves in there so that we're in range, and then we just go ahead and fill in the rest of them. Now you'll notice both alpha and beta waves tend to be fairly low amplitude, so they're kind of short waves, and you can really see the difference between them. Beta waves have these kind of bursts of activity followed by periods of more quiescent situation. And so beta waves, highest level of thinking; alpha waves, daydreaming. Theta waves are going to be common during certain stages of sleep, and then also you'll see theta waves sometimes in children who are awake and alert, or I should say awake and progressing throughout their day. You usually wouldn't see theta waves in an awake adult. So this is 4 to 7 hertz, and you'll notice the amplitude is noticeably larger. So we have a higher amplitude and a lower frequency. And so we made sure to put about 6 waves inside of the brackets there, so about 6 hertz. And the last of them we're going to look at is delta waves. Delta waves are going to be our highest amplitude waves. They are fairly synchronous, so this is happening during our deepest layers of sleep, deepest levels of sleep. It's fewer than 4 hertz, fewer than 4 waves per second. So I popped about 3 waves into the window there. And those are different types of brainwaves. Considering that an EEG is non-invasive and fairly simple and straightforward, a surprising number of things can actually be diagnosed this way using an EEG. One of the things that we oftentimes think about are things like the clinical evidence of seizures, epileptic seizures. You can actually localize exactly where inside of the brain they're occurring just by wearing these electrodes on the outside of the brain. But there's many other things that we can also take a look at. We can look at infarcts, or whether a person possibly has a brain tumor. We can actually localize that, which means we can find out where it is inside of the brain. We can diagnose a stroke by using an EEG. And of course, we can also look at a number of other things, but we can also look at sleep. So when we discuss sleep, one of the ways that we can tell which stage of sleep a person is in is by observing their brain waves. So there's two different types of sleep. REM sleep is rapid eye movement sleep, which is just what it sounds like. Your eyes actually move back and forth behind the eyelids. And then non-REM sleep, which is where your eyeballs are not moving, and it's most of the stages of sleep are actually non-REM. So we're going to list out 6 different stages here. Wakefulness, REM, which is actually a level that is just beneath wakefulness. Then non-REM 1, non-REM 2, non-REM 3, and then non-REM 4. And basically the way that I've listed them out is pertaining to the level of depth of sleep that we have. So non-REM 3 and non-REM 4 are also called slow wave 3 and slow wave 4 because these are the deepest levels of sleep and the brain waves literally slow down. So slow wave 3, slow wave 4, very slow brain waves, deep levels of sleep. So we're going to go ahead and draw the brain waves that basically pertain to each of these levels of sleep. Now, I'm not a neurologist and I cannot tell brain waves very well apart, but in my opinion, wakefulness, REM, and non-REM, especially if the wakeful stage is, say, alpha waves, which are kind of synchronous and not very interesting. Wakefulness, REM, and non-REM 1 all have what look to be pretty similar brain waves. Non-REM 2 gets a little more interesting. The waves are a little bit messier themselves, and then you have these sleep spindles, these spikes of energy in there, which we'll talk about in a moment. Non-REM 3 is going to have what looks to be theta waves, so 4 to 7 hertz, and then non-REM slow wave 4 is going to be delta waves, so fewer than 4 hertz. It's going to be your highest amplitude, and this is your deepest level of sleep. I'm going to be describing and drawing for you a typical night's sleep, if you will, but before I did that, I wanted to say a few more words about each of these stages. Non-REM 1 is actually the first sleeping stage that you'll come across, even though you do see REM right there listed just under wakefulness, and it is the stage of sleep that's closest to wakefulness. You actually don't experience REM right away. You experience non-REM 1 first. Non-REM 1 is very close to wakefulness. As you see, the brain waves are very similar. And at this stage, it's quite easy to wake somebody up again, and oftentimes the person doesn't even know that they're asleep when they're experiencing non-REM 1. Non-REM 2, of course, is quite interesting because it has those sleep spindles. We don't actually know exactly why sleep spindles exist, but we do have an idea that the latest research that I found on sleep spindles indicates that it corresponds with a burst of activity in those moments between the cerebral cortex, the thinking gray matter of your cerebrum, and your thalamus, which is sort of the intersection where decisions are made about where to send information. So it seems as though memories are actually consolidated, at least according to this particular theory, which does seem to be well grounded, but we'll see how the theories change over time. That's science for you. But it seems to make sense that during these periods of high activity, during these sleep spindles, that information is actually consolidated into the brain. So one of the important aspects of sleep is to make sure that memories are strengthened. Memories of things that you want to keep in your brain are actually strengthened during sleep. And it seems as though a lot of that activity is happening during non-REM 2, during those sleep spindles. Now, non-REM 3, slow wave 3, and also non-REM 4, slow wave 4. Both of these stages are going to be your deepest levels of sleep. It's quite difficult to wake somebody up when they're in this deep level of sleep. Some of your dreaming will happen during this time. Some of your nightmares will happen. If you are sleepwalking, it's probably the fact that you are in these deepest levels of sleep. What else? If you have night terrors, that's in these deepest levels of sleep. And then we come to REM, rapid eye movement stage of sleep. This is a special stage. Again, it is, as far as brain waves go, as far as an EEG goes, it is the closest level to wakefulness. However, REM is usually achieved only about an hour and a half to 2 hours into the night's sleep. Rapid eye movement, as the name suggests, is a period of time during which the eyes will move back and forth rapidly. In other words, your ocular muscles, the extraocular muscles that allow for eye movement, are going to be quite active. However, these are basically the only muscles on your body that are activated at this time. The rest of your body is literally paralyzed, which seems to have some bearing, some of the control being centered in the pons of the brainstem. So paralysis of the rest of your body while your eyes move back and forth. The importance of REM seems to be the dreams that happen during REM. Something to do with, although we are not sure exactly why we dream or what dreams mean or anything like that, there does seem to be some relevance in regards to memory expulsion during REM. REM is important to clean up parts of the memory that you no longer need. You're exposed to so many different types of information during the day that it's important to expel information that you no longer need, and therefore REM allows you to do that. It seems the expression of these dreams allows you to decide what's not important anymore and to get rid of it. A lot of what happens in your brain is important for its inhibition or for its depression, and this seems to be a pretty good example of that. A fairly well-known phenomenon that can occur probably happens somewhere between REM and wakefulness, which is called sleep paralysis. Sleep paralysis is an interesting phenomenon that happens to, a significant minority of people every so often, where it's happened to me twice that I can remember. You come awake at some point during the night. Your mind is awake, your eyes are open, you're looking around, but you cannot move. And so it seems as though the body is confused. There's some kind of confusion, maybe at the level of the pons, where the rest of your body is still feels like it's in REM. In other words, it's paralyzed, which is important. As you act out these dreams, you don't want to be moving around and actually acting them out. So this paralysis of your skeletal muscles is important. But during sleep paralysis, basically your mind is awake, and you're completely alert and you can remember everything that happened, but you cannot move your body. And it can be quite terrifying, especially if you've never heard of this phenomenon before. But hopefully, now that you've heard of it, if it ever does happen to you, you won't be quite as terrified as some people are. Sometimes people will experience hallucinations, such as, this is even frightening to talk about, but you can actually have the conception, you can have the idea in your head that there's a looming figure standing at the foot of your bed and watching over you. And you're absolutely convinced. A fairly typical idea behind sleep paralysis is that when it's happening, you're convinced that you're going to die. As disturbing as that sounds, it is reality, and it's important to talk about it because it is quite scary when it happens. When it happened to me, I had never heard of it before, and now that I've looked into it more, it's not quite as frightening. It's helpful to know that other people experience this and that it's normal. I did want to talk about a typical night's sleep. So typically what's going to happen is you actually go through non-REM 1, non-REM 2, non-REM 3, and then non-REM 4 if you have a nice healthy sleep cycle. That's actually going to be happening before you ever get to REM. I think there can be a misunderstanding sometimes because it looks as though, as we're studying on this night's sleep, that it's plunging through REM, but REM doesn't actually happen. You'll see that it happens about an hour and a half to 2 hours into the sleep cycle, basically at the end of the first sleep cycle of the night. And so REM is actually not a significant factor until well later into the sleep cycle. The importance of REM is that it seems as though this is the stage of sleep where things are forgotten that are superfluous. So you remember I talked about the sleep spindles. The sleep spindles in non-REM 2 are where we consolidate information that we want to keep. But REM is important for getting rid of information that we don't want to keep, which is actually quite important because otherwise you tend to cloud your thoughts and not have clarity of thought if you're not getting rid of information that these thousands upon thousands of pieces of information that you learn in a day, you want to get rid of the ones that you don't necessarily want to keep around. And it would seem as though that is the importance of REM. So here we have our first REM of the night, and then we plunge back into our deepest levels of sleep. You'll see that non-REM 4 is achieved twice, basically these first 2 cycles, and then we keep coming back up. And then our REM cycles are going to start to get a little bit longer, and we're going to be less likely to plunge into those deepest levels of sleep. So remember that REM is basically a level of sleep that's just under wakefulness, just short of wakefulness. And you'll see that in the later stages of sleep in the night, your REM cycles will get longer. Your sleep will not be as deep. You no longer achieve slow wave 3, slow wave 4 later in the night. You achieve much more REM, and then you eventually, of course, come back awake. Let's look at our timeline here. Our time in this case is going to be in hours. Our x-axis is labeled time in hours. And so we mark 1 hour at about the time that we've achieved our first deepest level of sleep. At the 2 hour mark, we've achieved REM. At the 3 hour mark, we're deep again. 4 hour mark, we're still in about non-REM 3. And 5, 6, and 7 is really dominated by the REM cycle.